Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm joined by my husband, Sush.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about our rankings for the BooktubeSFF Awards for 2020. So if you're not familiar, I will leave some links below to the Goodreads group for this, but the BooktubeSFF Awards is an award system given out by booktubers for works of science fiction and fantasy. And this year there were a couple of things that caused some delays in the voting period. So first there was COVID, and then the judges wanted to give some space to the Black Lives Matter movement in June. So they have pushed back the voting period a couple of times. As of us recording this video, they haven't yet announced when the actual voting period is going to be, but we thought we would go ahead and talk about our rankings since that should be upcoming soon. So we read in most of the categories, although we did skip the YA category. For each category, we're going to tell you sort of what our rankings are, and we're going to go by my ranking, but if Sush has some differences of opinion, he'll talk about those. And we'll just kind of tell you pretty briefly what we thought and how we ranked them. Okay, so the first category that we read for was Best Adult Fantasy. My lowest ranked fantasy at number 3 was The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, and I actually really enjoyed this, so I think that even as the lowest ranked fantasy, it was still quite good. The basic storyline in this is that there's a guy, Zachary, who discovers a book which actually talks about him as a child discovering a portal to another world, to the Starless Sea, and he becomes obsessed with this and actually finds a way into the Starless Sea. The Starless Sea is this beautiful sort of derelict grandeur type of world that's filled with fairy tales and magic and mystery. I really loved all of the parts that took place in the Starless Sea, but there were also some storylines that took place in the real world with Zachary, some mystery type things, and those were okay. So overall, I thought the atmosphere, the writing, the beautiful fairy tales, all of that was excellent, but I got kind of bored with the Zachary parts and the real world parts.
And I want to add here, I went through the audiobook of this, and I rather enjoyed the audiobook version. There are certain verbal tics and repetitions, and every chapter begins with Zachary Ezra Rollins, and that sort of a thing. But it really worked for me. It felt like it fit for the story.
Yeah, so overall, I was pretty happy with this book. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars.
Next up, we have The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon, and this was actually my favorite book of this category, although it's the second for Shannon. And this is an epic fantasy set in a world where there was a dragon that tried to, enslave the world and take over everything about 1,000 years back. The dragon was defeated, and it was very much a huge effort to defeat this dragon. And then time passes. The dragon's not defeated permanently, it's just put away. And as time passes, the various cultures of the world have different mythos leading to what actually happened, and their religions and things like that evolve from there in different paths. And there is one side of the world which venerates dragons, sees different kinds of dragons and that sort of thing, and one which thinks that dragons are evil and has a strong morality component associated with it. So what I really liked about this book essentially is that it's a very, very well fleshed out world. It's very rich in its atmosphere, and there's a lot of characters that are going through all sorts of things, and there are interweaving storylines, and it does that really, really well. For me, this was reminiscent of the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan. And if you wanted to get the Wheel of Time experience but not commit to 14 books, this book might be the way to do that. Although at 900 something pages, that is quite a bit of an investment in itself.
And for me, this was a really solid epic fantasy. I thoroughly enjoyed the world building. I really loved all of the lore, all of the different cultures. That was excellent. I did feel though that sometimes there were some issues with the plot where things resolved a little bit too conveniently. There were a couple of things that were illogical, a couple of characters that I felt acted in a way that wasn't necessarily consistent, these sorts of things. They were small, but they did get to me slightly. So I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars, and that's why it was my second choice rather than my first. And then my top rated fantasy book for this category is Gods of Jade and Shadow by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. I loved this book. It was so much fun. The basic premise is that it takes place in the Jazz Age in the 1930s in Mexico, and we follow Cassiopeia, who is a poor girl, teenage girl, who lives in her rich grandfather's house and acts basically as a servant. She's very mistreated. But one day she uncovers a box in her grandfather's room that has the bones of the Mayan death god in it, and he comes back to life and needs her help recovering missing pieces of himself throughout Mexico in order to regain his power and regain his throne of Xibalba, the underworld. So this story ended up being so much fun. It's basically a road trip story as they go throughout Mexico. You get all of these really cool different glimpses into the cities at that time. There's such a feel of place and atmosphere. I loved it, but more than that, I loved the mythology. So this integrates so much of Mayan mythology, which is fascinating, really cool magic systems. And in addition to that, I thought that it really disrupted my expectations. It took something that started out almost as a Cinderella story and really made it very different. It was very feminist, and it was very much a story of looking at responsibility, looking at your own responsibilities and looking at forgiveness and looking at kind of reflecting on how you have contributed to different things. I thought that there was so much in this that was just really cool in terms of themes as well as in terms of fantasy world building. So I absolutely adored it, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, and it's my pick.
And kind of building on what you said about disrupting expectations, I think that's really key here. Silvia Moreno-Garcia does such a good job of that in building characters that are non-traditional, or even if they have echoes of traditional, she does something interesting with it. This could have easily been just another Bildungsroman, but it doesn't do that. It goes above and beyond. The next category we have is for Best Adult Sci-Fi, and third on this list is Recursion by Blake Crouch. And in this book, there is a concept of something called FMS, or False Memory Syndrome. And the basic premise of this syndrome is that people sometimes suddenly get this feeling of an alternate, fully lived life that they have memories of. They have very strong memories of. And they're not able to reconcile their memories of this lived experience that they believe they have lived and these alternate memories that keep jutting in as well. And basically they go mad. So in this world, we follow the tale of 2 stories. One is basically a neurosurgeon who is trying to do Alzheimer's research, and she's motivated by the fact that her mom has Alzheimer's. The other character is kind of like a crusty old cop type character, and he's trying to investigate certain events related to FMS. So this book did not work for me. I DNF'd around 40%, and by the time by 40%, the book had not passed the Bechdel test. And
if you guys aren't familiar, Bechdel test is when there is any scene at all that has 2 women who are named talking to each other about something that is not a man.
And it's kind of like there are many women characters, and yet it does not, you know. They just don't interact with each other and things like that. And then there's also a couple of instances of strong male gaze like thing from the cop character. And the feel of the story started feeling a lot like Dan Brown's work or Ocean's 11 kind of a thing. And I'm just not interested in that type of story. And there was nothing that was gripping me in the story, so I stopped. I want to also mention that I generally struggle with DNFs. Whenever I DNF a book, I really feel the need to go back and finish it. I did not feel that with this book.
And I skipped this book entirely because I just really wasn't interested. I wasn't particularly interested because it is supposed to be very much a sci-fi thriller that has a lot of twists and turns and like really fast paced, and that's just not me. I like things slow, I like them contemplative. So I wasn't really that interested in it, and then I heard Sush talking about it not passing the Bechdel test. I'd actually borrowed this from the library. I even read the first page, and then I was just like, I just don't want to read this. So I skipped it entirely. So it's in last place.
Next up, we have Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. And this is something we talked about previously in the Hugo novel wrap-up. And I think I rambled a fair amount in that. I will try to keep it shorter this time.
And it's linked below if you guys want to see that.
Basically, the idea here is that there is a galactic empire with, various planets. Each planet is ruled by a house, and there are 9 houses that are of note and kind of ranked in order of power. And we follow the story of Gideon and Harrow, who are the Cavalier and the Necromancer from the 9th house, all of whom are participating in kind of like this competition to kind of promote one of the necromancers to what is called lictorhood, which is kind of a more powerful necromancer. And so basically it's kind of this thing where they all descend upon this one planet, and there is a mystery, there's all sorts of puzzles that they need to solve. Some teams cooperate, some teams sabotage, some team trying to bring order, some try to bring order forcefully. So all these things are going on here. This is a very irreverent book, and it was a lot of fun to read. Definitely something I enjoyed, and definitely something I will be continuing with, but not, say, good enough to beat out the #1 in our list.
Yeah, and for me, this was DNF. So I think that this book actually has some really good world building. I loved the world building, but the humor is not so much my style. It's very, very snarky, like some mean biting at each other that happens between Harrow and Gideon. And I just wasn't a fan of that, but I think that it could work for so many different people. I don't think it's a bad book. It just didn't work so much for me. Then for our #1 ranked book on this list, it is A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. This is another one that we went into depth on our Hugo novellas video, so again, that's linked below. But basically, this is such an interesting sci-fi. It takes place in this empire, the Teixcalanli Empire, and we follow Mahit, who is an ambassador from a small mining station, LaSalle Station, who goes to the center of the empire to replace the previous ambassador who died very mysteriously. And she has to navigate so many issues of political intrigue and the complexities of the court. She has to represent her station's needs while also feeling really torn between her heritage at LaSalle Station and her desire to kind of absorb and be part of the Teixcalanli culture. So this had so much in it about technology, about the ways that technology is used. It had a lot of things about culture, a lot of things about imperialism, about language and memory. It just had a lot of really interesting themes and topics that I got so much out of. Plus, it's a murder mystery that was a lot of fun in its kind of slow unraveling. So I thoroughly enjoyed this book. It's definitely my top ranked one. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars.
Yeah, this is kind of, I think for me, one of the best books I've read in quite a while. The themes of anti-colonialism, the themes of culture, comparison, it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
Our next category is Best Debut, and third in this list is The 10,000 Doors of January by Alix E. Harrow. This is a portal fantasy, and the story is centered around this girl called January Sculler. She is brought up roughly in a life of privilege, but she is a person of color-ish, in that people, when they see her, don't know what to make of her, and they just have this notion of othering her without knowing which other to fit her into. And she is brought up by this rich white man who is a collector, and she grows up in a mansion, and for all practical purposes, it feels like he is kind of giving her a life of privilege and trying to, meet all her needs and that sort of a thing. But at the face of it is different from what happens. He is actually kind of taking advantage of her, and this story then follows her kind of trying to escape that. So in a sense, this does counter some of the issues I've had in the past with with the short story from last year, where I felt like there was a little bit of white saviorism, and here it has a literal white savior, and then shows us that he is not to be trusted, and this is all a farce and that sort of a thing. But my problem is what happens after. I feel like there isn't very much character growth. January goes on all sorts of, adventures. And there are other stories that are also woven into this of other people going through various other portal worlds, and it comes together towards the end. Overall, a lack of character growth, a lack of consideration for characters, by characters for other characters, and generally some characters just being very, very, thin, kind of really made this book not work for me.
Yeah, also, we talk more about this also in the Hugo novel wrap-up, but this is a book that I skipped entirely, kind of boycotted, because I've had such issues with Harrow's short stories, and especially after hearing what Sush thought of the book and other people mentioning that they had similar issues with the representation in this, I just decided not to read it. The other two books that are in this best debut category are actually repeats from the sci-fi category. So our rankings are similar, with the number 2 ranking for Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, and then the number 1 ranking with A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine.
The next category we have is for best middle grade, and fourth in this list is Tunnel of Bones by Victoria Schwab. This is the second book in a series, and the basic summary of it is that there is this girl called Cassidy Blake who has a near-death experience that then allows her to see ghosts and communicate with them and kind of interact with them. And so basically, and her parents are kind of part of a ghost hunting crew sort of a thing, who go around trying to make shows in various places known for ghosts. And in this book, they go to Paris, and especially because Paris has the catacombs beneath it, that's their focus of it, and that's where the story is set. In general, I have liked a lot of lore surrounding the Paris catacombs, and I was looking forward to this. But what I found is I didn't really like the primary character. I feel like sometimes authors want to show a lack of maturity and wind up writing the characters as if they are stupid and mean. And that is what I wound up feeling about the primary character here. It's like she made a lot of bad decisions. I felt not because of lack of maturity, but because it almost felt stupid. It felt like not believable for me. And she was really, really mean and not listening to, her friends and things like that. And that doesn't make for a good reading experience. And I did consider DNFing it, but I continued on, and the story does pick up. Towards the end, there are some interesting things that I explored, and some of the problems that I had with how she treats her best friend are kind of at least looked at, if not resolved. And so there is something to it. Overall, I feel like it never gripped me. It didn't scare me, and being a horror story, even for middle grade, I feel like you can do a lot with middle grade. And so it was a serviceable read. It wasn't terrible, but I won't recommend it.
And this is another one that I skipped because there wasn't much about it that I'd heard people say that interested me. Just in general, it sounds like I don't like mean characters, I don't like illogical decisions, and I don't really like things also that are too pop culture-y in their references. And I'd heard that this one just was like over the top in that, so I just skipped it entirely.
Next up we have Dragon Pearl by Yoon Lee. And this is a story of Min, who is a fox spirit, and her brother has been accused of desertion. And so she sets out to kind of restore his honor, in a sense, to prove that he didn't desert and that sort of thing. And in this world, fox spirits are, it's a very Korean mythos inspired world. So you have dragon spirits and various other kinds of spirits as well. But in this world, fox spirits are thought to be extinct. And this is because of a lot of prejudice against them. And so any living, surviving fox spirits are basically hiding, and they don't let anyone know that they still exist. And this is also a world where the original planet that Min comes from has a fair amount of technology, but also a fair amount of squalor and corruption and, things like that. And so basically she has to escape from her planet and then kind of go hunting down to figure out what happened to her brother who's, joined the elite space force, and then try to find out how, the story of his desertion came to be and that sort of thing. What I found about the story was that Min was exceedingly reckless, and in a way that didn't make sense to me for characters who are brought up in a strong environment of persecution. I feel like this is something that is really, really drummed into you if you are persecuted against. And it's kind of like it was just a story of Hijinx's in a sense, where it felt like the characters I just didn't like, and basically there's a lot of things that are happening one after the other, which are again full of bad decisions. The world building is fantastic, but the characters I just could not. So it's a rollicking adventure, and if you can look past the characters, definitely something that is enjoyable. There is a lot of interesting aspects, like spaceships have chi, and engineers use chi flows to debug, and things like that. So there's like some neat things going on there, but overall still not an enjoyable reading experience.
And for me, this is another one that I DNF'd. I just got very annoyed with all of the, like Sush said, the kind of reckless endangerment that Min had for everybody around her. I think it was just very frustrating to read, even though there was some cool world building. So I was sad that I didn't get to experience all of that world building, but I was getting way too annoyed with the decisions and how the plot kept moving way too fast in ways that just didn't make sense. So it wasn't for me. Then in second place, we've got Dead Voices by Katherine Arden. This is the second book in a middle grade horror series. I do recommend reading the first book first. It follows a group of 3 friends, Ollie, Coco, and Brian, and they go with their parents over winter break to a cabin in the woods to go skiing in the mountains, and things go wrong. Basically, they get snowed in and they discover that this resort that they're going to has only just opened up, and it is a refitted previous orphanage that has lots of ghosts. This book was actually surprisingly scary. I don't usually do horror because I'm such a scaredy cat. This was just on that edge. I really enjoyed a lot of it. It was very atmospheric. I think that the horror was really well done in bringing a lot of kind of adult scary tropes into a middle grade appropriately. And it really focused on a lot of issues of friendship and of communication and of like figuring out when you should speak up. I especially love that this book included Coco's perspective. Ollie is somebody who we got the main point of view from in the first book, but in the second book it trades off between Ollie and Coco, where Ollie is super headstrong. Coco's a lot more unsure of herself, but very cautious and very thoughtful when she does act. So I liked getting her perspective on this. I thought it was really cool, but there were also a lot of frustrating aspects where Ollie was being way too headstrong and refusing to communicate, that while maybe they were part of a growth arc for her, just got a little frustrating in the middle for me. So I ended up giving it 4.5 out of 5 stars.
And kind of adding to that, it's kind of like what frustrates me about kids showing lack of maturity in other books, basically not being immature, just being stupid, does not happen in this book. The kids are very intelligent. They are making decisions for reasons that completely make sense to them. They are grumpy, or they're unsure, or they're insecure. I think that is worked in really, really well. This book is a rich, complex character study. So, yeah.
Then our top ranking for the middle grade category is Sal and Gabi Break the Universe by Carlos Hernandez. I adored this book so much. I did a standalone review of it, so I'll link that below if you want to know more. But this is basically about Sal, who moves to Miami with his parents and enrolls in a special art school where he is studying to be a magician. He loves magic. But actually, he can do real magic, not just tricks, because he can pull items from other dimensions, other universes into his own. This doesn't always go so well, though, and one of the kids at his new school, Gabi, who is the student body president and the newspaper reporter and editor, she gets a little concerned when she sees him doing these tricks that do not have explanations and starts investigating. They end up becoming friends and doing lots to kind of help out people around them. This book was so great. One, it was hilarious. It was so much fun. It had so much adventure. I loved the characters, especially their relationships. This modeled so much of just healthy friendships, of communication, of how to apologize when you've done something wrong, of non-toxic masculinity. It also discussed some more serious issues. Sal has type 1 diabetes, and there's quite a few scenes in here where he talks about needing to have insulin or talks about how he needs accommodations at school, these sorts of things, but without making him any sort of lesser character. He's still the hero of the story. He's still the person who can do all sorts of amazing things. There's also a lot in here that is heavier. There's some things about like child abuse and neglect. There's also things about illness. There's so much in here that's really, really deep as well as so funny. It was one of those books where you're laughing one second, crying the next, and just so amused the next one. It really was such a fun read, and I thought it was just perfect, exactly what I'm looking for in a middle grade, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars.
And this book, for me, I think personifies a wholesome read in a sense. And like Shannon was mentioning, it's like it doesn't stray away from dark topics. There's a lot of it, and yet it's like all the people are, I mean, you really feel for them and you really connect to them, and that is done so, so well. I will mention one thing that didn't work for me in this book is some amounts of boundary pushing that I felt are kind of like a cultural thing that I think happens a lot in Indian culture as well, that I think was present here. But I will add on saying that this is something that is referenced and actually kind of talked about in the follow-up Sal and Gabi Fix the Universe, which for me is also a phenomenal read. Read this and read the Sal and Gabi Fix the Universe as well. And the last category we have is Best Short Work. And third in this list is The Test by Sylvain Novelle. And this is a book about an Iranian immigrant to Britain taking citizenship that will determine whether or not he and his family, get to be citizens. So this is a near future dystopian. It basically tries to imagine how such a test would look like. And basically that's the premise of the rest of the book. This is not a book that I can talk about the plot or anything of that sort without giving any spoilers, so I will talk a little bit about the theme of the book in a sense. For me, this book is kind of an exploration of what happens when a country considers another country a shithole country, so to speak. And it basically is a notion of when you try to devise a test to try and separate the good people, the good immigrants from the bad immigrants. It's like, what does that test say about who you are in that sense? Or what does that say about your national identity? And in that sense is very much a criticism of the Western immigration systems. While I am not Iranian and have not immigrated to the UK, I am Indian and I immigrated to the US. And there is a certain amount of dehumanization in the process that I really, really connected with. Even if you take the test at the face value, the kind of questions that they ask in the test, which kind of prop up a very high ideal notion of themselves, is something that is definitely at odds with a lot of reality. So basically, I think for me, this really, really worked in many levels. The other thing that I'll mention here is that for me, this it has a mild sci-fi element, but what I would really compare it to is a Black Mirror episode. It's been compared by others and I agree. I think this is much more environmental horror, which kind of builds up an environment of stress and just keeps tweaking it up as the book goes. And I really, really enjoyed that. I also want to mention that the audiobook version of this is phenomenal. I don't know if I would have had such a high opinion of the book if I had read it versus listening to the audiobook version of it. And while I know that I'm very much in the minority in this opinion, this is actually my pick for the BooktubeSFF Awards for the short story category. There were other books in the Hugo categories, I think that would have beat this for me, either The Haunting of Tramcar 15 by P. Jelly Clark, or The Deep by River Solomon, or Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom by Ted Chiang. But among the books listed here, this is my pick.
Yes, it's in third place because I disliked it, and we're going by my ranking. Also, if you want to hear more about those other novellas that Sush mentioned, we do have a Hugo novellas video, so I'll link that below. There were some really awesome novellas this year, so I don't know quite why we didn't see some of those on this list. Maybe they just weren't as popular for BookTube readers. But yeah, this book, while I agree with Sush that the themes were really interesting, I just really didn't enjoy the execution of it. I don't like books that are too fast-paced, especially ones that manipulate your emotions, and this one felt very much intentionally like an emotional roller coaster, and I resented that. I really disliked the experience of reading this, despite thinking that the themes were interesting. So I only gave it 2.5 out of 5 stars, and it was the lowest on my ranking. Next, for second place in my rankings, is This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amala Motar and Max Gladstone. This is a book that actually both Sush and I DNF'd, but I'll go ahead and talk about what I noticed of it. Also, this one is one that we talked about in the Hugo Novellas thing, so if you want more, you can go there. But basically, it is a story about time travel and about two corporations that are at war trying to change the timeline to benefit them more. And we follow two agents, Red and Blue, who work for opposing corporations, and they keep kind of going and trying to change things to help their corporations and foiling the other person's attempts. So they're at odds, but they end up having a correspondence that eventually leads to them falling in love. So it didn't get to the point where they've fallen in love, but it was okay for the part that I read, just not interesting enough to keep me going. It was something where I loved the world building in terms of each of these places in the timeline that they went to. It was very fantastical. So I really liked that, but the letters between them I just wasn't interested in. It had a sense of humor that didn't work for me. I'm very picky about humor, so that just didn't work for me, and I just was never really engaged. So I ended up DNFing it.
Yeah, me too. It's like the worlds were nice, but they felt throwaway, and the letters were the point, and the letters themselves didn't completely work for me. So
yeah, it definitely wasn't something that I disliked, but I just didn't choose to continue. And then my top ranked short work was To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. This is another one that we discussed in the Hugo Novellas wrap-up, so again, I will link that below. But basically, this is a sci-fi story that takes a look at 4 scientists who are going to explore 4 different worlds and planets to learn from them. And when they go to each of these, because these worlds are very, very different, they do something called soma forming, which is where they alter their own bodies to adapt to that atmosphere. It's kind of the opposite of terraforming, which is adapting an atmosphere to your own body. And the point of it is that they're trying to learn from these planets, from these different life forms. It is very much a philosophical story, looking at what it means to explore, what it means to understand other life forms. And it focuses a lot on kind of the opposite of colonialism, really. The opposite of trying to force everything to be your way. You're trying to learn from those. And I liked a lot of that message, a lot of that love of science and exploration. But it was also something that wasn't perfect. I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. It was something where, not always engaging, didn't always feel connected to the characters, these sorts of things.
I really enjoyed this. I think the soma forming bit and the philosophical angle definitely are what make it for me. I think this is a gentler attempt, more enlightened, if you will. And it even kind of criticizes itself in that regard. Is this really more enlightened and that sort of a thing. I think it's a really enjoyable read.
Yeah, it definitely brought up a lot of interesting questions, so I liked it for that. But again, if you check out our Hugo novellas video, there's some other novellas that came out this year that were 5 stars for me and just absolute favorites. So I was a little disappointed that this one was the top ranked one in this category for the BooktubeSFF Awards. But again, these were the choices, so this is what we voted for. Okay, so those are our rankings for most of the BooktubeSFF Awards categories for 2020. If you guys read for the BooktubeSFF Awards, if you ranked things differently, or if you've read any of these books, you have any thoughts, any comments, anything else, go ahead and leave us a comment down below. We'd love to hear from you.